really is? His answer shakes the room. This isn't just a trial. It's the day truth goes live. But in the end, what did Jasmine say that brought the empire to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The marble corridor outside hearing room 214 thrummed with anticipation. Reporters packed tightly behind velvet ropes, cameras aimed at the sealed double doors like they were waiting for a verdict. Inside, the air was thick, every seat filled, every screen glowing, every breath held. This wasn't a standard hearing. This was a showdown. The banner above the room read, "Special Hearing on Corporate Media and the Integrity of American Democracy." But the real headline was simpler. Rupert Murdoch versus Jasmine Crockett. When the doors finally opened, silence hit like a punch. Murdoch stepped in, flanked by lawyers, walking with calm authority and the kind of smirk that only comes from decades of unchecked power. His presence alone seemed to drain the color from the room. He didn't just enter, he claimed the space, scanning the room like it still belonged to him. But this time, he wasn't the one asking the questions. Across the room sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoving. Her suit was sharp, her eyes locked on Murdoch with the precision of a marksman. No laptop, no binder, just a sealed manila folder in front of her, like a detonator. She didn't glance away, didn't acknowledge the cameras. She knew this moment was bigger than sound bites. This was about forcing the empire of misinformation to answer to the truth it buried. Outside, protesters held signs that read, "Democracy is not for sale." Inside, the room braced for impact, because this wasn't just about one man's lies. It was about how many voices they had silenced. And today, Jasmine Crockett was speaking for all of them. The silence didn't end when Rupert Murdoch took his seat. It evolved. From a quiet before the storm into something heavier, something personal. It became the sound of two legacies colliding. On one side sat Murdoch, architect of empires, the man whose headlines could swing elections and whose studios churned fear into profit. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, daughter of the South, forged by injustice, propelled by truth. Their first eye contact was electric, but not theatrical. It wasn't the kind of stare exchanged for the cameras or to score points. It was older than that, deeper. Like two histories recognizing each other as opposing forces. One built systems, the other was here to break them. Murdoch didn't wait long. Leaning back slightly, he adjusted the lapel of his dark, bespoke suit and offered her a smile that had sold wars. His voice was low, but crisp, laced with both contempt and confidence. "I've made presidents," he said without blinking. "And you, Crockett, what exactly have you done? Besides cry about race like it's still 1963? The room didn't gasp, but it recoiled. Committee members shifted in their seats. Aides' fingers hovered above their keyboards. The remark wasn't just offensive, it was calculated. This was Murdoch's playbook. Dismiss, belittle, control the room with arrogance. But what stunned everyone wasn't what he said. It was what Jasmine didn't say. She didn't shoot back. No raised voice. No visible anger. She simply looked at him for a long, measured beat, eyes still, posture untouched. And then, without looking down, she opened the manila folder in front of her. The motion was deliberate, even quiet, but it carried the weight of a gavel strike. The first page was slid forward across the table, perfectly aligned with the mic. In bold type, centered like a verdict, the title read, "A Collapse Engineered, Murdoch and the Machinery of Manipulation." No commentary, no exposition, just the truth, printed and placed like evidence on the battlefield. Murdoch's smirk didn't vanish, but it cracked, just enough for the cameras to catch it. Because that moment wasn't about volume, it wasn't about rage, it was about control. He had entered expecting to dominate the stage like he had done for decades, with his networks, his headlines, his reach. But now he realized this wasn't his stage. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to play the part of another outraged Democrat for Fox News to mock in post-show recaps. She was here to dismantle him, quietly, completely, and in front of the very America he thought he owned. Murdoch's smirk hadn't fully faded, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A flicker of calculation, maybe even caution. Jasmine Crockett could see it. but she didn't acknowledge it. She didn't speak to the man sitting across from her. She spoke to the room, to the millions watching beyond these walls, to the Americans who had lost loved ones to lies, who had watched their neighbors turn against them over conspiracies that crawled from the glow of a television screen into the streets. Her hand hovered above the folder only a moment before she pulled the next sheet free. Clean, precise, and marked with one word at the top in bold: verified internal correspondence. The monitors behind her flickered to life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence would scream for itself. A timestamp appeared on the screen. October 17th, 2020, 11:34 p.m. An internal message from a senior Fox News producer to network executives read, "We know this voter fraud claim hasn't been substantiated. Legal says we can't confirm it, but if we don't lead with it, we'll lose ground to Newsmax again." Another message followed, this one from an executive vice president. "We're not in the truth business. We're in the ratings business. Push it hard." Jasmine let the words sit there. No commentary, no dramatic music, just silence, and the stench of something rotten in the foundation of American trust. The camera zoomed in slightly as she lifted her eyes from the folder, gaze steady. "These aren't opinions," she said. "They're orders, top-down decisions to air falsehoods, not because you were misled, but because fear sells better than facts." The murmurs started then. Press, committee aides, even one or two senators exchanging glances. Jasmine didn't look at them. She gestured and the video shifted to footage darker in tone, grainy and low-lit. A behind-the-scenes clip, off-camera, off-script, but painfully real. On screen, a Fox News anchor sat slouched in his chair during a commercial break, rubbing his temples. "I can't say this again," he muttered. "It's not true. We know it's not true." Another voice replied from somewhere off-camera, casual, almost bored. "Then don't think, just read. It's what they want. We've got midterms to win." The clip ended abruptly. No music, no fade-out, just a black screen. And then Jasmine's voice. "This is not a slip-up. It's a business model." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, her voice still steady but now layered with something colder. "Resolve. You broadcast lies with full knowledge they were false. You allowed conspiracy theories to fester because you feared a dip in viewership more than a collapse in democracy. And then you stood behind your network while communities burned, while people died, while families were torn apart, because the numbers on your Nielsen chart were more valuable than the truth." The hearing room didn't erupt. It sank. The weight of what had just been shown wasn't explosive. It was corrosive, slow, creeping, irreversible. No one interrupted, not even Murdoch. His fingers, which had gripped the edge of the table earlier, now rested loosely in his lap. His expression didn't betray much, but it no longer radiated control, because for the first time, he wasn't dictating the narrative. He was the headline. The silence after the video ended wasn't just stillness, it was paralysis. Words had been shown, not spoken. Truth had been exposed, not argued. And in that moment, the entire room felt suspended between disbelief and something darker. Recognition. Recognition that the line between misinformation and profit wasn't crossed accidentally. It had been paved, polished, and trafficked by design. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't lean in. She simply waited, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle like dust on a battlefield. All eyes shifted to Rupert Murdoch. The room expected resistance, a deflection, a denial, anything. But what came next was more chilling than any of those things. Murdoch's expression didn't crack. No sweat beaded his brow, no tremble reached his voice. His face was still, ageless, unreadable, as if sculpted in the image of detachment itself. He adjusted the mic with a single knotted finger, leaned forward slightly, and spoke with the casualness of a man reading from a balance sheet. "I didn't create the appetite," he said. His voice was low, almost bored. "I just served what they were already hungry for." The words hung in the air like smoke in a sealed room. There was no outrage in them, no remorse. Just a shrug dressed as strategy, as if lies were justified by ratings, as if public trust was just another commodity to be sold by the metric ton. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver, but around her the discomfort shifted into something closer to horror. Committee members sat frozen. Staffers glanced up from their notes, unsure if they had actually heard what they thought they'd heard. Murdoch had just confessed, not to wrongdoing, but to intent. Not to a mistake, but to a business model. And in doing so, he had made one thing unmistakably clear. He saw no guilt in it, no cost, no consequence. What Jasmine Crockett faced in that moment wasn't just a powerful man, it was an ideology, one that saw truth not as a responsibility, but as an inconvenience. One that reduced the suffering of millions into market demand. And for a second, just a second, the weight of that reality pressed down with unbearable clarity. Because how do you argue with someone who doesn't deny the damage, only denies that it matters? He had admitted the truth, and it didn't move him. But Jasmine's composure did. Her silence unnerved him in ways the evidence never could. For Rupert Murdoch, silence was either surrender or strategy, and Crockett's silence was neither. It was presence, it was control, and that made her dangerous. So when logic failed to rattle her, he reached for the oldest weapon in the playbook of power. Insult disguised as critique. If he couldn't break her credibility, he would try to reduce her to a caricature, a soundbite that could be replayed on the networks he once commanded. Murdoch's voice shifted. Cool arrogance gave way to thinly veiled contempt. He leaned slightly forward, adjusted his cufflinks, and locked eyes with her across the table. "Let's stop pretending," he said. "You, Congresswoman Crockett, are not a truth teller. You're a product." He let the word hang in the air. A product of cheap education and the politics of victimhood. Your entire career is built on grievance, not governance. The room inhaled sharply, but he didn't pause. You point fingers. You stoke outrage. You sit here playing savior to communities you keep angry so they keep you in power. Then came the pivot. The screen behind him lit up, not with data, not with policy, but with curated clips, sliced and sharpened for one purpose: humiliation. Footage from protests in Dallas, from town halls where Jasmine had spoken with fire about police violence, housing injustice, institutional bias. Each clip was out of context, robbed of nuance, overlaid with Fox News chirons that screamed, "Radical Democrat rages against America," or "Crockett, system rigged against black people." The audio was manipulated for impact, her voice rising mid-sentence, faces in the crowd blurred, emotion framed as extremism. Murdoch gestured toward the screen like a trial lawyer before a jury. "This is not a leader. This is performance," he said. "You've built your name on division, BLM, race politics, victim narratives. You don't want to fix this country. You want to shame it into submission." His tone didn't spike, but his intent sharpened. He was no longer addressing her. He was addressing the public watching from their living rooms, their phones, their feed loops, reaching through the camera to reignite the fear he had spent decades perfecting. The blow wasn't just personal, it was structural. It was a man born of media power trying to erase a woman born from its consequences, to turn her identity into her liability, to cast her clarity as chaos. And as the smear played out behind her, Jasmine sat still, not because she was unmoved, but because she knew exactly what this was. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a pattern, a script. And for the first time, it was being read out loud in a room where the truth finally had teeth. The room had just been flooded with Murdoch's version of Jasmine Crockett, distorted, decontextualized, and conveniently aligned with every fearful stereotype his empire had profited from for decades. But even as her name was dragged across the screens behind her, even as her voice was twisted into something unrecognizable, Jasmine didn't react the way he wanted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't defend her character. Because she knew this wasn't about her. It was about the machine. And machines don't stop because you yell. They stop when you cut their power at the source. With deliberate calm, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick document. No fanfare, no drama. Just a quiet, confident placement of 32 pages between her and the man who thought he could define her with a clip. On the front, the official seal of the Federal Trade Commission. She turned it toward the committee, toward the cameras, toward the country. This, she began, her voice firm but unwavering, is not a protest chant. It's not a headline. It's not a soundbite. It's a federal investigation. She opened to the first marked page, a yellow tab sticking out like a loaded chamber. This document, she continued, details how Fox News executives and producers knowingly manipulated video content related to Black communities, editing footage to remove critical context, amplifying moments of conflict, and muting those of resolution. She didn't look at Murdoch when she spoke. She looked at the American people through the lens. They didn't make mistakes. They made choices, choices that turned pain into profit and truth into rating strategy. She flipped to another page, then read aloud. In one documented instance, footage of a police encounter was edited to exclude verbal de-escalation attempts and peaceful surrender by the suspect. The altered version aired on primetime, leading viewers to believe the incident involved violent resistance. Her hand trembled for just a second, but not from fear. From fury, she refused to let detonate too early. The suspect in that video was 17. His name was Julian Carter. He was unarmed. He complied. But your version, she said, finally turning her gaze back to Murdoch, told millions of Americans he was a threat. The room was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating. Because this wasn't about journalism anymore. It was about consequences. Real lives, real families, real harm. Jasmine didn't pound the table. She didn't need to. The truth she held in her hand carried more weight than any accusation Murdoch had hurled. And in that moment, what she said wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning, a reminder that when the powerful rewrite reality, it is always the voiceless who bleed. And just as the weight of Julian Carter's name settled like a quiet funeral into the conscience of the room, Jasmine Crockett didn't pause for effect. She didn't let the moment rest, because she understood something that Rupert Murdoch had built his career on manipulating: timing. She knew that truth, when revealed piece by piece, could shake trust. But when truth arrived all at once, raw, personal, undeniable, it could shatter systems. So she did not look at Murdoch when she spoke. She turned to the committee and said, with a steady voice that held both restraint and gravity, "Madam Chair, I call one more witness." That one sentence rearranged the air. The door at the back of the hearing room opened, and a tall, dark-skinned man stepped forward, his posture straight, his eyes tired but unflinching. He wore no network pin, no smug expression, just a charcoal suit and the quiet fury of someone who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. Jasmine gestured toward the seat beside her. "This is Elijah Raines," she said clearly. "He served as a senior segment editor at Fox News for 6 years. He was let go after refusing a directive to manipulate footage of a police shooting involving an unarmed Black father of 3. A flicker of discomfort crossed Murdoch's face. Not fear, but recognition. Elijah sat down, adjusted the microphone, and cleared his throat once. When he spoke, his voice was measured, professional, but laced with something deeper. "I was asked to re-edit the segment," he began. "They told me to cut the part where the officer called for backup, to trim the footage so the suspect looked aggressive. I said no. I was off the story by the next day. By the end of the week, I was gone." The silence that followed was sharper than any scream. Then Jasmine raised a document. It wasn't thick, just 3 stapled pages, but the top was marked with an internal routing code from News Corp editorial command. "This is the email thread," she said, "between Mr. Raines's supervising producers and senior network content directors." She opened to a highlighted section and read aloud. "Do not let this become another Crockett soundbite. Downplay the footage. Cut the mother's statement. Make sure we open with visuals that suggest chaos, not grief. We can't let her types have ammunition." The final line wasn't editorial policy, it was strategy. Urban volatility sells. Calm does not. Jasmine placed the email in front of the committee with quiet finality. This wasn't news curation. It was narrative construction, intended to suppress empathy, to inflame division, and to deny justice the space to breathe. Elijah looked up then, straight at Murdoch. and delivered his final words with the weight of someone who had once believed the system could be fixed from the inside. "I thought I was hired to tell the truth," he said, "but I was being used to engineer perception. And when I refused, they made an example of me." In that moment, the hearing room transformed. No longer a space for performance, it had become a courtroom, not of law, but of legacy. And Rupert Murdoch wasn't just being questioned. He was being confronted by the very people his empire had misrepresented, silenced, and erased. One truth at a time, Jasmine Crockett was dragging the unseen into the light. And now it was not just her voice the world had to reckon with. It was one of Murdoch's own, turned against him. The air inside the hearing room was no longer still. It was suspended. Elijah Raines's testimony had peeled back the curtain on the machine. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. What she had just exposed was the mechanism. What came next was the architect. She stood slowly, the weight of the room shifting with her. No grand gestures, no raised voice, just precision, just truth, sharpened to a point. Her eyes locked onto Murdoch, this time not with restraint, but with the clarity of someone done asking for permission to speak. She raised her hand and pointed, not with aggression, but with intent. Her finger didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. "Mr. Murdoch," she began, voice clear and resonant, "why is it that a billionaire from Australia gets to decide how Americans see each other? How we define truth? How we understand our neighbors, our elections, our democracy?" The question didn't echo. It pierced. "You've never lived in the communities your headlines destroy. You've never stood in the grocery store line behind the mother your network called dangerous. You don't live with the fallout. We do." She paused, then held up a folder with the Harvard crest embossed on the front. "This," she said, "is a peer-reviewed study conducted by the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, published just last year. It tracked media consumption habits, political attitudes, and racial bias across more than 10,000 households." She flipped to a highlighted page. Viewers who consumed over 5 hours of Fox News per week were significantly more likely to express racially charged beliefs, fear-based views on immigration, and support for authoritarian policy measures, even when controlling for prior ideology. Her tone was measured but unrelenting. "You didn't just reflect division, you amplified it, you branded it, you broadcast it until it became the common language of fear in this country." She took a step closer to the table, not in aggression, but in resolve. "Your empire didn't just report on America. It rewrote it. It told one group of people that they were under attack and told another that they were invisible. And then you sold ad space between the panic." Her hand came down, firmly but quietly, placing the research on the table in front of him. "What you've built is not journalism. It's a distortion field, one that bends reality until truth can't breathe." The room held its breath, but Jasmine's next words came low and deliberate. "So I'm asking, not as a lawmaker, not even as a witness to this moment, but as an American citizen, how did we let someone who's never pledged allegiance to this country control how millions experience it?" She didn't blink. "And more importantly, why are we still letting you do it now?" In that instant, the cameras zoomed in, not on Murdoch, not on the committee, but on the truth sitting quietly on the desk between them. A study, a question, and a woman who refused to look away. The silence after Jasmine's question wasn't empty. It was trembling. The kind of silence that comes not from confusion, but from confrontation. A question had been asked not just of Rupert Murdoch, but of an entire system. How did a man who never voted here get to shape what Americans fear, who they trust, and who they blame? The Harvard study sat between them like a quiet indictment, peer-reviewed, airtight, impossible to wave away. For a brief moment, the weight of truth hung in the air like a thundercloud waiting to break. And then Murdoch spoke. Not with outrage, not with remorse, but with something colder. Something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "I didn't create the hate," he said, voice flat, eyes unmoved. "I only reflected it." The words were soft, but they hit like a steel door slamming shut. It wasn't a defense. It was a declaration, not of innocence, but of detachment. Murdoch wasn't denying the destruction his empire had sown. He was denying it mattered. He leaned back slightly, as if the conversation bored him now, as if pointing a camera at a fire absolved him of lighting the match. People are angry, he continued, and we give them what they're already thinking. We don't invent anything. We hold up a mirror. A mirror, that's what he called it. The nightly segments that turned grieving mothers into suspects. The graphics that splashed mugshots across primetime without verdicts. The edited footage, the race-baiting chirons, the relentless us versus them drumbeat that turned neighbor against neighbor. A mirror. As if his network didn't choose the angle, the lighting, the soundtrack, the spin. As if it didn't cut out every frame that showed complexity, humanity, or grace. Jasmine didn't speak, not yet. Around her, staffers shifted in their seats. The gallery gripped with a collective stillness that felt like the edge of a cliff. Murdoch's words had not just exposed a lack of empathy, they revealed something far more dangerous. The belief that responsibility ends where profit begins. He wasn't defending what he'd done. He was redefining it as inevitability. As if racism, division, and fear were natural resources, and he had simply mined them better than anyone else. It was a chilling inversion of logic. A billionaire from another continent, standing in the capital of a fractured nation, declaring that he hadn't broken it. He'd simply held up a mirror to what was already broken. And if that mirror happened to be designed to enrage, to distort, to sell, that wasn't his problem. That was ours. The room had begun to settle again, but not in comfort, in dread. Murdoch's words hung in the air like poison. I didn't create the hate, I only reflected it. It was a phrase designed to end conversations, to kill accountability, to turn mass manipulation into passive observation. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, because she knew that behind every one of those deflections lived a deeper truth. The kind of truth that couldn't be scrubbed by press releases or legal spin. And now she was ready to reveal something not even Rupert Murdoch's vast empire could control, a truth that came from within his own bloodline. She stepped back to the table, lifted a thick cream-colored envelope from a separate folder, and paused. The weight of what she held was different. It wasn't another report, it wasn't government data, it was handwritten, and it was personal. She turned toward the committee, her voice quiet but charged with intent. This, she said, holding up the envelope, is a private letter. It was never meant for the public. It was written by someone who bore the Murdoch name, but refused the Murdoch legacy. The room stilled. Murdoch's expression, for the first time in hours, shifted, not into fear, but into something close to irritation. Recognition. Jasmine opened the envelope slowly and pulled out a single folded letter. Lined paper, ink smudged slightly on the lower corner. It's from his granddaughter, she said clearly, an executive in training at Fox News who walked away from a six-figure future because, in her own words, she could no longer be part of a company that turned truth into a currency. Jasmine unfolded the page and began to read. Her voice didn't waver, but her cadence slowed, giving the words room to land. I used to believe we were informing the world, but what we were really doing was bending it, one segment, one headline, one image at a time. You told me journalism was about giving people what they needed, but all I saw was us feeding them what made them afraid, not to protect them, to own them. A collective shift moved through the audience like a ripple. Murdoch said nothing. Jasmine kept reading. You always said the camera doesn't lie, but we taught it to lie better than anyone else. We turned outrage into a product, truth into a trade. I can't carry that. I won't. Not in my name. She lowered the page then, not for effect, but for air. The weight of the words hung heavier than anything shown so far. She turned fully toward Murdoch and stepped forward, the letter still in hand, now held just inches above the desk between them. This isn't from your critics. This isn't from the left. This is from your own family, from someone raised under your roof, taught to inherit your empire, and instead chose to walk away from it. Her voice sharpened, not with volume, but with clarity. So let me ask you now, Mr. Murdoch, she said, eyes locked on him. When the cameras are off, when the lights go down, when you're no longer the man behind the curtain, Do you ever ask yourself what you've truly built? Her hand tightened slightly on the page. Do you know what your legacy is, beyond ratings and headlines and boardroom wins? Do you know what's left behind when the echo chamber fades? Then she raised the letter slightly, letting it catch the glare of the lights above, the blue ink glinting faintly beneath the cameras. Because from where I stand, it's not journalism. It's not leadership. It's not even power. It's fear. It's doubt. It's a country that no longer knows who to trust. Because for decades, you sold them mirrors painted as windows. The room was silent again, but not in stillness, in reckoning. Jasmine didn't lower the letter. She let it stay there, trembling slightly now in her hand. Not from nerves, but from the force of restraint. You didn't just distort the story, she said, voice softening, without losing edge. You made generations afraid to believe in one another. You made neighbors think of each other as threats. You turned difference into danger and truth into theater. Murdoch didn't respond. For the first time, the stillness on his face looked less like control and more like refusal. He didn't blink. He didn't move. But everything around him did. Journalists were scribbling furiously. Phones buzzed in pockets. The hearing room wasn't a chamber anymore. It was a courtroom. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't delivering questions. She was delivering judgment. She folded the letter gently, returned it to the envelope, and placed it face up on the table before him. That is the last voice you never expected to hear, she said, and it's the one you can't spin. The letter was still on the table when the world outside began to move. Slowly at first, then with the violent velocity of something undeniable finally breaking free. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed Rupert Murdoch. She had exposed something larger. A media ecosystem built on engineered fear and profitable distortion, finally called to account not by a rival tycoon or political machine, but by a black congresswoman armed with truth, restraint, and a name no one in that room would ever forget again. And the world noticed. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, the first hashtags began to appear. Not from verified accounts, not from campaign staff or media pundits, but from students, organizers, first-time viewers who had never watched a congressional hearing in their lives. Murdoch exposed. Truth over ratings. Crockett versus Empire. 3 words that ricocheted across the globe like thunder. By midnight, they were trending in 23 countries. By sunrise, they were unavoidable. TikTok edits of Jasmine holding up the letter to Murdoch's face were overlaid with cinematic music. Twitter reposts of her question, "Do you know what you've built?" had racked up tens of millions of views. On YouTube, her full testimony went viral under a simple title, "The Moment the Empire Cracked." But this wasn't just digital applause. It was uprising, and the boardrooms felt it. Inside Fox Corporation's Midtown Manhattan headquarters, the mood was no longer defiant, it was fractured. Emergency calls flooded the upper floors. Shareholder legal teams began circulating internal memos, referencing potential fiduciary violations and reputational damage. The video of Elijah Reigns' testimony was replayed again and again in legal strategy meetings, not for clarity, but to gauge how much worse it might still get. Executives whispered behind closed doors about contingency plans, about liability, about the unspoken fear, what if we really lose the public? That question had never felt real before. Fox had survived everything, from phone hacking scandals in London to billion-dollar settlements in U.S. defamation suits. But this was different, because this wasn't a lawsuit. This was moral indictment. It couldn't be settled quietly. It couldn't be buried under NDAs or diluted in spin, because the messenger wasn't a corporate rival or partisan commentator. It was a woman who looked like the very communities Fox had spent years marginalizing, and this time she had all the receipts. By midday, a coalition of Fox shareholders led by activist investor groups publicly demanded an independent investigation into editorial practices and leadership culture. Reuters, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal, ironically owned by News Corp, published breaking headlines quoting Crockett's question verbatim. How did we let someone who doesn't even vote here define our democracy? The line had gone from hearing transcript to rallying cry. Protesters gathered outside News Corp's New York headquarters, waving signs that read, media for the people, not for profit, and you sold us hate. But the most unexpected movement came not from seasoned activists or watchdog journalists. It came from the young. In dorm rooms and high school classrooms, in coffee shops and on subway platforms, something began to stir. A generation raised on fragmented feeds, finally seeing the mechanics behind their own mistrust. For many, this was the first congressional hearing they had ever streamed. Not because they cared about politics, because they wanted to see the moment someone, anyone, held power to account in a way that actually mattered. And Jasmine delivered. Clips of her standing, holding the handwritten letter from Murdoch's granddaughter, became digital canon overnight. College students reenacted the moment in mock trial clubs. Young journalists posted reaction videos, tears in their eyes, whispering, "This is why I do this." A senior at Howard University posted a thread titled, "Why Jasmine Crockett Just Changed the Game," which amassed over 3 million interactions. In it, she wrote, "We've been told to stay in our lanes, to wait our turn." She didn't. She walked into that room and tore the mask off the most powerful media empire in the world, and didn't raise her voice once. Meanwhile, Fox's internal world spiraled. Senior producers began leaking more emails. An anonymous editor posted on Reddit detailing how coverage directives were passed down to frame immigration protests as threats and to deliberately conflate gang activity with Black Lives Matter rallies. Whistleblowers began contacting journalists at The Atlantic, NPR, and CNN, offering documentation of editorial censorship, internal memos discouraging empathetic language, and a system of bonuses tied to viewer engagement volatility, a corporate euphemism for outrage metrics. Rupert Murdoch remained silent. No statement, no interview, no response. And in that silence, America filled in the blanks. The question Jasmine had asked, "Do you know what you built?" became a national conversation, not just about Murdoch, but about all of it, about how stories are chosen, about who gets to speak, about what it costs to tell the truth in a country that often rewards the opposite. Editorials across major newspapers, from the Boston Globe to the Houston Chronicle, echoed a single sentiment: the reckoning is overdue. In schools, media literacy programs saw unprecedented signups. Nonprofits reported a surge in donations earmarked for independent journalism. High school teachers printed Jasmine's closing statement for their civics units. Professors invited her to speak on panels not about policy, but about moral courage. And yet, for all the celebration, Jasmine herself remained grounded. In a brief interview with PBS, she said only this: "This isn't about me, it's about the cost of lies. It's about who pays for them, and it's about how long we're willing to keep letting someone else decide what the truth is." Back in Washington, other members of Congress began proposing formal reviews of media consolidation laws. A bipartisan subcommittee announced an inquiry into political bias in corporate newsrooms. The Murdoch hearing was no longer just a footnote, it was a turning point. And still, amidst all of it, a single image remained frozen in time across countless screens. Jasmine Crockett, standing with her hand outstretched, holding a letter that was never meant to be read, asking a question that couldn't be ignored. A billionaire had built an empire on fear, and a woman with no media backing, no billionaire donors, and no need to shout, had cracked it wide open, with truth. The hearing room did not erupt when the gavel fell. It did not cheer. It did not shout. It breathed, as the final word from the chairwoman echoed, "This hearing is now adjourned." The weight of the past 5 hours pressed into every corner of the chamber, like heat after lightning. There were no applause lines, no standing ovations, just silence, pulled tight like a cord between two figures seated at opposite ends of American history. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her hands resting on the table before her. The manila folder closed now, as if the truth it carried had already been set free. And it had. Across from her, Rupert Murdoch didn't stand immediately. For a man who had shaped presidents, collapsed governments, and whispered into the ears of nations, he now looked impossibly small. He reached for his cane, the same polished black one he'd entered with. But this time his grip took just a second longer to settle. His knuckles, once curled around the levers of global media, were pale with tension. He pressed the cane to the floor, rose slowly and muttered, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to himself. She just taught me something, he whispered, his voice gravel pressed through regret. You can't control the story forever. It wasn't a confession, it was a realization, and Jasmine heard it. She turned calm and poised, then stepped toward him. Not to strike, not to shame, but to leave him with the one thing he had spent a lifetime avoiding: clarity. Her heels tapped softly against the wood floor as she closed the distance. One beat, two. Then she stopped, not quite at his side, but just within earshot. Her voice was low, razor clean, and devastatingly certain. You wrote America's story in ink soaked with fear, she said, but I'll rewrite it in real blood, in real names, in truths that buried mothers and brothers have been screaming for decades. You controlled the narrative. I'm here for the reckoning. Murdoch didn't speak. Couldn't, because no spin could unmake what had just unfolded in front of the world. Jasmine held his gaze a moment longer, not in victory, but in closure. Then she turned away, gathered her folder, and began walking toward the double doors at the back of the room. Not as a politician leaving a hearing, but as a woman walking out of fire with ash on her shoulders and truth in her hands. Behind her, the gallery rose not to follow but to witness. Reporters stared, frozen. Aides clutched tablets with screens still streaming live footage to millions. Committee members sat hollowed out, unsure whether they had just watched a deposition or a paradigm shift. And Murdoch, once untouchable, once invincible, now stood alone. A monarch without a throne, still gripping his cane, still unsure whether the crack beneath his feet was just the floor or the legacy beginning to collapse under its own weight. Outside the hearing room, the hallway had transformed into a gauntlet of flashing lights, microphones, and restless questions. But the moment Jasmine stepped through those doors, the noise didn't hit her. It parted, like the sea before something sacred. She didn't flinch, didn't slow, didn't stop. She kept walking, each step more deliberate than the last, not just away from the Capitol, but towards something bigger, a future not yet written, but now undeniably hers to shape. On every television screen in America, they replayed the last image from inside the chamber. Jasmine Crockett standing alone, eyes forward, a single manila folder clutched like a weapon, as a man who had once defined truth now sat beneath it. And the people didn't just watch, they listened, because in that moment, it wasn't a hearing, it was a reckoning. Outside, the wind had picked up. Across Washington, rain clouds hovered as if even the sky had held its breath for what had just taken place. Down the Capitol steps, Jasmine paused only once, when a young intern ran up behind her, barely 20, shaking with adrenaline and awe. "Ma'am," the girl said breathlessly, I think you changed something today." Jasmine looked at her, really looked, not as a supporter, not as a voter, but as someone from the generation that would inherit everything this empire had distorted. She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, nodded and said only, "Then make sure it stays changed." No camera caught it, no soundbite carried it, but the moment rippled through every digital feed like a quiet explosion. Across the country, people weren't just reposting her speech. They were translating it, remixing it, turning it into chants at rallies, into questions at classrooms, into demands at boardrooms. That night, the Murdoch stock dipped nearly 9%, not from a lawsuit, not from regulation, from exposure. Inside his penthouse office in New York, aides paced while lawyers drafted what would become a statement released the next morning, filled with the usual language: commitment to transparency, editorial integrity, reflection on recent events. But it wouldn't be enough, not this time, because now the truth had a face, and it didn't wear makeup. It didn't sit behind a news desk. It didn't ask for airtime. It stood on the record and said, "Enough." Somewhere deep inside the Capitol, the lights of room 214 flickered off for the night. The chairs were empty now, the screens dark, but the echo of what had been said, what had been revealed, remained. It would remain long after the last reporter filed their story. Long after the networks tried to reshape the narrative. Because a woman had walked into that room and didn't just testify. She dismantled, she exposed, she rewrote, and she left not just with her truth intact, but with an entire generation watching and following. The empire had cracked, the lie had been named, and the ink finally had run dry. The storm didn't pass, it deepened. As Jasmine Crockett's closing words echoed across newsrooms, lecture halls, and kitchen tables, the tectonic pressure that had built up beneath the surface of American media for decades finally cracked. The hearing had been the match, but what followed was the fire, and the blaze found its next fuel not in politics, but in court, where lies weren't just immoral, they were actionable. Just 7 days after the congressional hearing, a class action lawsuit that had been quietly building for over a year burst into full public view. Filed on behalf of over 2,300 plaintiffs, including victims of election lies, families misrepresented in protest coverage, and everyday viewers psychologically manipulated by misinformation. The case accused Fox News of knowingly and repeatedly disseminating false information for profit and political gain, with reckless disregard for the truth and human safety. The evidence used in the case? Nearly every file Jasmine Crockett had exposed on national television. Emails from inside Fox showing orders to ignore retractions, internal memos warning against fact-checking for fear of losing viewers, clips where hosts contradicted on-air narratives in private texts, and the smoking gun, statistical proof from the Harvard study connecting Fox's programming to a measurable increase in hate crimes, polarization, and social unrest. The trial moved fast, faster than anyone expected. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was undeniable. For the first time, a federal judge allowed not just compensatory damages to be considered, but punitive damages on the grounds of systemic media malpractice. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was flooded with press, legal scholars, and family members of the plaintiffs, many of whom had lost jobs, reputations, even loved ones, as a direct result of false narratives. Some sat holding framed photos of victims whose names had never been cleared. And then came the moment. On day 18 of the trial, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. 12 men and women, black, white, Latino, Asian, military veterans, retired teachers, a former Fox viewer among them. They filed in, stone-faced, not a single glance toward the defense table. The judge cleared his throat, silence tightening like a rope around the room. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs. There was no sound except the shuffle of paper. Then the final number landed like a bomb. Fox News Corporation is hereby ordered to pay $1.2 billion in damages. Gasps erupted, not from the courtroom gallery, but from across the country. Breaking news banners blasted the figure on every screen. $1.2 billion. The highest financial penalty ever awarded against a news organization in American history. Higher than tobacco settlements. Higher than oil spill compensations. A number large enough to matter? Large enough to break something open. Fox's lawyers sat frozen, their carefully rehearsed counters evaporating on their lips. Murdoch, notably absent, released no statement. But insiders leaked that the boardroom had descended into chaos. Shareholders began filing their own legal claims. Advertisers, terrified of brand association, began pulling contracts. The Dow dipped. News Corp's valuation plummeted by nearly 14% in under 6 hours. Outside the courthouse, the sidewalk erupted in applause, not from protesters or activists, but from victims. People who had been smeared, mocked, erased. People who had written emails for months begging for retractions that never came. A woman in her 50s who had lost her teaching job after being falsely accused of anti-police hate speech on national television wept openly into the shoulder of her son. "We didn't think anyone would believe us," she said, "and now the truth costs something." Jasmine Crockett wasn't in the courtroom that day. She didn't need to be. But her presence was everywhere, in the legal precedent, in the media coverage, in the voices of the plaintiffs who told reporters, "We filed because she made us believe we could win." That night on the steps of her district office in Texas, Jasmine stood before a sea of microphones, not to gloat, but to ground. Her voice was clear but quiet, not celebratory, resolute. "This isn't a victory," she said. "It's a warning. You cannot use fear as a business model and expect immunity forever. You cannot twist the truth and call it freedom. And you cannot tell the American people who to hate, who to blame, and who to fear, then act surprised when they bleed." She paused, scanning the crowd. Not for the press, but for the people watching from home. People like Julian Carter's mother, Elijah Raines. The millions of Americans fed a distorted image of their own country by men who mistook ratings for reality. "We didn't ask for a war on the media," she continued. "We asked for a media that remembers the difference between freedom of the press and freedom from responsibility." Then she stepped down, not into the arms of security or staffers, but into a crowd of young people waiting by the sidewalk. One girl, maybe 16, held up a cardboard sign. "Journalism or propaganda? Choose." Jasmine nodded once. No smile. Just truth. And the country kept watching. Cable panels exploded that night. Fox News hosts avoided the ruling entirely during primetime. They led instead with crime reports and foreign conflict. But the audience wasn't buying it. Ratings dropped by 34% overnight. Meanwhile, competing outlets began airing extended specials on disinformation, quoting Jasmine's hearing testimony line by line. The New Yorker ran a cover story, "Truth on Trial, the Woman Who Made the Empire Bleed." Pulitzer-nominated columnist Dana Jacobs wrote, "Crockett did more than question a mogul. She stripped the spell of inevitability from a network that believed itself untouchable." On Capitol Hill, the ripple effects turned into political momentum. 3 bipartisan bills were introduced within a week of the ruling: the Media Ethics and Transparency Act, requiring public disclosure of editorial manipulation; the Broadcast Accountability Reform Act, proposing financial penalties tied to verified disinformation; and the Public Trust Doctrine expansion, recognizing media literacy as a constitutional protection in education. And through all of it, Jasmine Crockett kept her tone measured, unmoved by celebrity, unshaken by attention. In an interview with NPR, she was asked if she felt like she had won. Her answer came without hesitation. This was never about winning. This was about breaking the cycle, the one where truth dies quietly and power profits from the silence. In homes across the country, survivors of media distortion exhaled for the first time. They had seen justice, expensive, public, undeniable, and they had seen who delivered it. Not a billionaire, not a media conglomerate, but a congresswoman from Texas with no network at her back and no reason to keep quiet. Just one folder, and the courage to open it. The courtroom had fallen silent, the billion-dollar judgment now inked in legal history. But outside, a different kind of storm was gathering. It didn't roar with protest or rage. It surged with recognition. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a media empire or forced accountability from the untouchable. She had awakened something deeper, the long-dormant belief that truth, in the hands of the right person, could still matter. That one voice, sharpened by injustice and armed with evidence, could rupture the foundations of an empire designed to silence millions. And from that moment forward, Jasmine wasn't just a name, she became a symbol. Within 48 hours of the verdict, bookstores across the country reported record-breaking pre-orders for a newly announced memoir, The Hearing That Shook the Empire. Written entirely by Jasmine, with no ghostwriter and no PR filters, it was a first-hand account of the 5 months leading up to the hearing, from the night she first opened the folder of leaked internal Fox emails, to the moment she stood in front of Rupert Murdoch and held up a letter written by his own granddaughter. The prose was not poetic, it was surgical, unapologetic, brutally clear. "They didn't just twist the truth," she wrote. "They manufactured it, packaged it, sold it between ads for pharmaceutical fear and gold bullion paranoia. And then they blamed the people who bled." The book sold over 700,000 copies in its first week. It topped the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today bestseller lists simultaneously. A rare feat for a political memoir, even rarer for a sitting congresswoman without a presidential campaign or media contract behind her. College classrooms assigned it. Libraries ran out of stock. Readers lined up for hours at signings, not just to meet her, but to say thank you. But Jasmine refused to let the moment become performance. She declined interviews with entertainment outlets. She turned down offers from HBO and Netflix. She refused every corporate sponsorship that tried to capitalize on her name. When a luxury car company offered her an endorsement deal framed as a partnership for truth, her response was 5 words. Truth doesn't ride on chrome. Instead, she returned to Texas, to her district, to the people who had sent her to Washington not to climb, but to fight. She held town halls in small churches and civic centers, where she read passages from the book out loud and asked elders in the crowd how they'd seen their own lives twisted by headlines they never wrote. And still the country watched. At Howard University, a wall-length mural was painted of Jasmine standing in front of the Capitol, folder in hand, flames rising behind her. Not destructive flames, but illuminating ones. Beneath it were the words, "She made them look." Across social media, young activists tagged her daily. Crockett doctrine began trending, a tongue-in-cheek phrase that now referred to the belief that public office wasn't just about making laws, but dismantling lies. It was taught in media ethics courses, debated in journalism panels, referenced on cable news by hosts who had once called her unprofessional and combative. And then came the CNN interview. She hadn't planned to take it, but the network had offered her one unfiltered hour, live, no commercials, no edited segments. She agreed only after they promised not to preview questions. On the night of the broadcast, nearly 4.2 million Americans tuned in, some expecting a victory lap, some hoping for mistakes. They got neither. Instead, they watched a woman sit still in front of the country and speak like the weight hadn't left her shoulders, but grown sharper in its clarity. Midway through the interview, the host asked, "You've taken on the most powerful media institution in the world. You've changed the landscape. How do you feel knowing they're still broadcasting tonight?" Jasmine didn't blink. Her answer was quiet, devastating. "He has a news network," she said. "I have the truth. And in the end, the truth goes on air." It was more than a soundbite. It was a turning point. Within 20 minutes, the clip was shared by senators, students, journalists, and organizers across all 50 states. By dawn, it had been translated into 9 languages. Protest banners were printed with that line. Tattoo shops in Austin and Oakland reported clients requesting it across their shoulders, ribs, and wrists. Because in one sentence, Jasmine Crockett had done what no headline could. She reminded the country what truth sounds like when it's not afraid, and she wasn't finished. Following the book's success, Jasmine declined calls to run for Senate or join presidential tickets. Instead, she funneled proceeds into the creation of a national initiative called Truthline, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting local journalists, whistleblowers, and community leaders targeted by misinformation and defamation. Within 6 months, Truthline had over 300 lawyers and investigators, with satellite offices in cities long overlooked by legacy media. Its tagline was simple: "We defend what deserves the mic." At a press conference launching the initiative, Jasmine spoke without podium, without teleprompter. "I'm not here to silence media. I'm here to remind them of their job. If you're afraid of the truth, you're not doing journalism, you're selling anxiety." She didn't just speak to reporters, she looked at them, daring them to hear themselves. Behind the scenes, former staffers from major networks, MSNBC, CNN, even Fox, began contacting her team. Many wanted to testify. Others wanted to join Truthline. The machine was shaking, not collapsing, but cracking, and the cracks were letting in light. Meanwhile, in the political arena, a new class of leaders emerged, citing Jasmine as their reason for running. State representatives, school board candidates, first-time mayors, people who had been told they were too angry, too direct, or too much like Crockett. Now they wore that comparison as armor, and Jasmine? She kept showing up, quiet, precise, unmoved by attention, still carrying the folder, because what she'd proven wasn't just that power could be challenged. She proved that when the cameras roll, and the lights are bright, and the system leans hard on silence, truth doesn't need to shout to burn the whole lie down. The spotlight eventually moved on. The cameras dimmed. The trending hashtags faded, replaced by newer stories, newer names. But something remained, something deeper than a headline or a verdict. Jasmine Crockett's story was no longer just about a hearing, a courtroom, or a billion-dollar fall from power. It had become something else entirely, a parable in real time, a test of what this country was willing to believe, and more importantly, what it was willing to change. Because beneath every moment of triumph, every line of sharp truth, there was still the quiet weight of what had been endured. And it is there, in the scars, not the speeches, that the human lesson lives. It would be easy to say this was a victory of good over evil, of one voice defeating a giant, but that would be dishonest. The truth is far more complex. Jasmine didn't walk into that hearing as a hero. She walked in as a woman who had been underestimated, interrupted, edited, and dismissed her entire life. A woman who knew that truth, on its own, is often not enough, that it must be carried, defended, and sometimes shouted until someone finally decides to listen. She faced a system that had long protected those who blurred the line between journalism and propaganda. And she stood not with an army, but with a folder, her name, and the weight of every lie her community had ever been forced to swallow. The lesson is not that one person can fix everything. It's that one person can force everything to look in the mirror. Jasmine didn't dismantle Fox News in a single sentence. What she did was something rarer. She disrupted the comfort. She made those in power uncomfortable with their own narratives. She made viewers confront the idea that their nightly dose of certainty may have been carefully engineered fear. And she reminded the forgotten, the misquoted, the misrepresented, the erased, that they are not crazy and they are not alone, that someone sees them. And she did it without shouting. She did it with facts, with fire, and with the kind of composure that only comes from living through the very injustice she was exposing. But there's another layer still, and it's the one no one puts on a billboard: the price. Because this kind of truth-telling comes at a cost. Jasmine had her past dragged across the internet. She received death threats. She had news segments edited to paint her as hostile, aggressive, divisive. She lost donors. She lost allies. She lost sleep. And yet she never lost her voice. The real lesson, then, is not just about courage, it's about endurance. The kind that doesn't flinch when the machine pushes back. The kind that keeps showing up, not for applause, but because silence has never protected the people who look like her. So what are we left with? We're left with a choice: to accept that the truth can be bent into entertainment, or to fight to keep it whole, to allow those with money and microphones to dictate our fears, or to demand that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, gets the last word. We're left with the reality that democracy does not fail in explosions. It fails in whispers, in headlines that lie by omission, in the quiet normalization of deception for profit. And we're left with Jasmine Crockett, a living reminder that history is not always written by the powerful. Sometimes it's rewritten by the persistent. Her final words in that CNN interview weren't just a mic drop, they were a manifesto. He has a network, I have the truth, and in the end, the truth goes on air. That is the lesson, not that the truth wins easily, but that when it does, it changes everything. And it doesn't ask for permission. It demands to be heard. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. When Jasmine Crockett confronted Senator Tom Cotton for calling slavery a necessary evil, the hearing didn't just spark outrage, it ignited a full-blown battle over truth, history, and power. With 619 pages of suppressed documents and a 98-year-old witness whose ancestor was once sold to Cotton's family, she broke through decades of silence in under 5 minutes. The video went viral within 2 days. Millions of views, a nation divided, a lie exposed, and Congress forced to revisit what it had tried so hard to bury. But what exactly did Jasmine say that shook the entire system to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Room 214 felt more like a vault than a hearing chamber. Sealed, silent, and suffocating. The walls held no warmth, only the cold weight of expectation. This wasn't just another political showdown. It was a collision between memory and myth, truth and denial. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, as if reluctant to witness what was coming. Tom Cotton entered first, sharp suit, square jaw, and the calm arrogance of a man who'd never been truly challenged. Republican senators flanked him like sentinels. He didn't look nervous. He looked entitled. To him, this hearing was a formality, a moment to reaffirm control, to rewrite history with polished rhetoric and unwavering conviction. Then Jasmine Crockett stepped through the side door. No announcement, just presence. She wore a black blazer with a Harriet Tubman pin that gleamed like a dare. In her hand, a 619-page dossier, the weight of erased history. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Every step forward said, "I've bled for truth you've only read about." When she sat, silence fell like a verdict. Cotton looked over, but this time the usual script wouldn't save him. Jasmine's folder stayed closed, for now, but its contents and the fire behind her calm promised one thing. This was no hearing. It was a reckoning. And just as the gavel's echo faded into the charged silence of room 214, the screen behind the senators came to life. Not with evidence, but with memory. A video, 4 years old, grainy from countless re-uploads, filled the chamber with a voice too calm for what it was saying. The founders viewed slavery as a necessary evil upon which the Union was built, Tom Cotton stated in July 2020, standing tall before a row of flags and a wall of silence. His delivery was deliberate, measured like a surgeon's cut. There was no hesitation, no acknowledgement of pain, just a sentence that landed like lead in the lungs of every American who still carried the weight of chains, whether from family lineage or lived experience. He didn't flinch, and that perhaps was the most dangerous part. For him, this wasn't a controversial opinion. It was doctrine. The video played out in full, 15 seconds that history would come to remember more than some entire presidential terms. It had vanished quickly from mainstream media back then, but it never really disappeared. It lived quietly, on phones, in classroom debates, in hushed conversations among teachers afraid to speak too loudly, until it was reborn. 1 month before this hearing, Cotton introduced a bill to block the 1619 Project, a Pulitzer-winning initiative that reframed U.S. history around the consequences of slavery, from public education nationwide. His reasoning? That the project was ideologically toxic, a distortion of patriotic truth. But when the video clip resurfaced alongside his proposal, it didn't just reignite an old fire. It created a storm. The fury spread faster than any campaign. First on Twitter, then TikTok, then the streets. A high schooler in Chicago held up a cardboard sign outside her campus. "Necessary for who, Senator?" That image alone was shared over 11 million times in a weekend. College campuses canceled classes to hold teach-ins. Churches held vigils. Parents, teachers, students, veterans, all asking the same question. How could a nation claim moral authority while defending its darkest crime as foundational necessity? In over 30 states, protests ignited. They weren't chaotic. They were organized, generational, interwoven with grief. Elderly Black veterans walked beside Gen Z organizers. Descendants of enslaved people marched shoulder to shoulder with Holocaust survivors. And in the middle of it all, the phrase became a chant, then a movement. Necessary for who? The phrase didn't just question Cotton, it questioned the entire framework he stood on. From her district office in South Dallas, Jasmine Crockett watched it all unfold. On her phone, on TV, out her window. She didn't just see the rage, she felt the exhaustion beneath it. The kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing the fight never really ends, it just changes clothes. She heard from teachers suspended for teaching the truth. She spoke with students confused why their pain was considered unpatriotic. And she listened to a mother who said her 10-year-old came home crying because his textbook still called enslaved Africans workers. That was the moment Jasmine stopped being a spectator. She didn't ask for the hearing. She demanded it, not for herself, but for every voice that had been labeled too loud, too angry, too inconvenient for the official version of America. And when Congress finally agreed to convene this closed hearing on the educational and historical implications of Cotton's statement and proposed legislation, She didn't just prepare a legal rebuttal. She prepared a reckoning. The stakes weren't academic. They were existential. This wasn't just about a sentence. It was about who gets to write the sentences that define a country's soul. And so, when the screen dimmed and the image of his own words dissolved into silence, Tom Cotton didn't retreat. He leaned forward, as if nothing about what had just played disturbed him, as if the backlash, the protests, the pain, it all proved his point. History, he said, voice steady like a judge's sentence, should not be repainted with emotion. His eyes scanned the room slowly, landing briefly on Jasmine Crockett with a clinical coldness. We must teach facts, not feelings, he continued. America rose from the ashes of its own imperfections. That's not a stain to erase. It's a story to be proud of. The way he said it, like the suffering of millions, was a regrettable but necessary paragraph in a glorious epic, hit the room like a slow-building explosion. He spoke of resilience as if it were his to claim, of wounds as if they were his to interpret, and for a moment it seemed the room might fall for it, that the calm rhythm of his rhetoric might win over the chaos of truth. But Jasmine didn't blink. Her jaw tightened. Her knuckles whitened around the edge of her folder. Because what he was doing wasn't just defending a statement, it was weaponizing distance. Distance from pain, from blood, from names that were never written in the history books because they died in the margins. His logic was polished, yes, but it was hollow. The kind of logic that turns chains into metaphors and plantations into economic footnotes. He called it objectivity, but Jasmine knew better. It was sanitized injustice, institutional indifference dressed in Ivy League grammar. And now, sitting directly across from him, she felt the full weight of what she had walked into. Not a debate, but a battlefield where truth itself was on trial. But the silence that followed Tom Cotton's last sentence didn't hold. It fractured, quietly, cleanly, like glass beneath a hairline crack. Jasmine Crockett shifted in her seat, not out of discomfort, but with the precision of someone preparing to detonate truth in the middle of comfort. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need volume. She had weight. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low and unwavering, each word like stone dropped into still water. "America didn't overcome slavery. It was built on it." The room stopped breathing. The sentence didn't just contradict Cotton. It exposed him, stripped the polished logic from his argument, and laid bare the truth it tried to bury. That the foundation of this country wasn't freedom. It was ownership, human ownership. She didn't blink. She didn't shift. Her eyes locked onto his with the kind of calm only fury knows. "You say we've risen," she continued, her voice steady, but heavy, like a verdict. "But some of us are still crawling out of graves we never had time to mourn. And you, standing on the hilltop, are calling it progress because you never had to dig." Her words struck the air like steel on flint, controlled, precise, but unmistakably combustible. Cotton's face didn't move, but his silence deepened. It wasn't the silence of confidence anymore. It was calculation, too late and too thin. The tension in the room surged like electricity. Aides glanced up but didn't dare speak. Some senators leaned back, others forward, as if unsure whether to retreat or listen harder. Jasmine didn't stop. She pressed forward, not for drama, but for clarity. "You think acknowledging pain is weakness. That teaching truth is divisive. But what's more divisive? Telling the full story or hiding behind the edited one?" She paused just long enough to let the question hang like a blade suspended in air. "You speak as if history is neutral, but neutrality only ever protects the powerful." Then softer, but sharper. "I walk through institutions every day that were never built for me. I speak in rooms that once barred my name. I know exactly what this country overcame and exactly what it chose to keep." Her voice didn't tremble. It clarified. It cut through the air like cold, light-breaking fog. This wasn't defiance. It was restoration. And everyone in that room, every aide, every senator, every camera feed secretly running outside, felt it. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to make sure no one left this room untouched by the weight of what America refuses to face. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Because when someone speaks the truth with nothing to gain and everything to lose, silence becomes the loudest sound in the world. The silence that followed Jasmine's last words wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things never spoken aloud in rooms like this, and she knew it was time. With steady hands, she reached for the manila folder in front of her. Thick, worn, its edges dulled from months of preparation, years of history, and generations of silence. She opened it without a sound, like someone opening a casket not of death, but of truth long buried. Inside were carefully preserved pages, faded ink, cursive loops, broken grammar that carried unbroken dignity. "These are letters," she said softly, "written by people who were never meant to be remembered, let alone read aloud in this building." She looked up, locking eyes with the Senate panel. Letters from the enslaved, written in the late 1700s, addressed to the very men who built this nation and called it free. The room leaned in, consciously or not. She selected one page, its corner torn, the signature smudged with what looked like dirt, but might have been dried sweat. Holding it up with reverence, she read, "If we are necessary to your nation, then our suffering must be your foundation." Her voice was clear, low, measured. Every syllable carried the weight of someone who understood she wasn't reading history, she was unearthing it. "You trade our bodies and speak of liberty. You break our backs and praise the strength of the Republic. You silence our names, then say history was silent." She paused, letting the air absorb the words. This was written in 1790, not by a scholar, not by a general, by a man who was only given a number on a plantation ledger, but still dared to write to Congress. The room transformed. The temperature didn't drop, but it felt colder. Cotton didn't move, but the stillness around him shifted from control to calculation. One senator on the far right of the dais sat back and rubbed his temple. Another tapped their pen, then stopped. The rhythm of power had been interrupted. Jasmine lowered the letter slowly, her fingers lingering on the parchment like she was setting it down in the soil it came from. She didn't embellish, she didn't explain, because the truth doesn't need permission to stand. Cotton's eyes were fixed on the page now, not with curiosity, but with something harder to define. Disbelief, perhaps, or the dawning awareness that what he had dismissed as abstract had just spoken with a human voice. After a moment, he cleared his throat, sharply, audibly, like trying to reclaim the floor. He adjusted the mic, sat up straighter, and then he began to speak, not with anger, but with forced control. But the cadence was different now. Offbeat, his words no longer dropped with authority. They landed with hesitation, because no matter what he said next, it would now exist in the shadow of that letter, a voice from the grave that refused to be buried again. But Cotton wasn't finished. The letter had landed hard, but he had come prepared, with something darker than denial, the tactic of deflection. As Jasmine lowered the fragile parchment back into its folder, he leaned forward and reached beneath his own stack of papers. His movements were crisp, deliberate, like a man about to pull a trigger he believed would end the argument. "If we're going to talk about the roots of this nation," he said, voice tighter now, each word clipped like a marching order, "then let's also talk about who's trying to rewrite it." He pulled out a stapled packet and slapped it onto the desk, the echo sharp in the quiet room. "The Congresswoman's office," he began, eyes locked on the panel, not on her, "has received significant financial support from the New American Legacy Foundation, a group repeatedly condemned for promoting historical revisionism and anti-American narratives." He let the accusations sit, heavy and coiled. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked at the room, the press, the public. He wasn't speaking to her. He was performing the discrediting of her. "Let's not pretend this hearing is about truth," he continued, tone rising just enough to slice through the tension, "when the very foundation of her argument is funded by those who profit from division. She talks about letters, suffering, history, but what she's really doing is turning inherited trauma into political capital." There was a shift in the room, a flicker of uncertainty, not belief, but attention. Cotton smelled it and pressed harder. You don't fight for justice by cashing checks from organizations that vilify the founding of this country. You don't honor the past by manipulating it into a campaign strategy. And with that, he sat back. Not relaxed, but calculated. He had launched his counterstrike not with fact, but with implication. Because implication didn't need to be proven, only planted. It didn't matter that the foundation in question had also funded bipartisan historical literacy programs. It didn't matter that the accusation was wrapped in political theater. What mattered was that he'd painted Jasmine as compromised, conflicted, opportunistic. In a room that measured everything in perception, that was enough to wound, even if it wasn't enough to win. Jasmine didn't look away, but she could feel it. The weight of being a black woman speaking hard truths in a chamber designed to mute them. The burden of being told that pain, when it came from her lineage, was suspicious. She wasn't just being questioned. She was being framed. Not as a witness, but as a threat. Not as a voice of history, but as a distortion of it. And that more than the accusation itself was the cruelty. Because the injustice wasn't only in what Cotton said, it was in how quickly the room was willing to listen. The moment hung heavy, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Charged, inevitable. Tom Cotton's words still lingered in the air, his accusations sharpened to wound, not to argue. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look away. She didn't blink. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. She leaned forward, the weight of generations behind her, and spoke not like someone defending herself, but like someone reclaiming a ground she never should have had to fight for. If pain is the only political capital this country ever handed me, she said, her voice calm and controlled, but burning with something deeper, then I will spend it with purpose, not performance. She let that land before continuing. Because unlike you, I don't need to rewrite history to make it serve me. I carry it with me. I am the consequence of it. There was no performance in her posture, no raised voice, just truth leveled with precision. I didn't build a career out of grievance, she continued, her tone tightening like a drawstring. I built a platform out of absence, out of names no one ever taught, out of documents no one ever cited, out of pain that was passed down, not as anger, but as warning. Her words didn't rise. They deepened, gained gravity. You want to talk about legacy? Mine isn't carved in marble. It's stitched into death records, auction logs, court transcripts where justice never came. She paused, eyes still locked on his. So if you think I'm here to win sympathy, you've already misunderstood me. I'm not here to be understood. I'm here because someone has to say what history refused to. The room didn't shift. It held still, because there was nowhere for the tension to go. Jasmine didn't ask for validation. She didn't seek applause. Her voice was too full for that, too full of what was never allowed to be said before. She had been called radical, ungrateful, divisive. But in this moment, she wasn't any of those things. She was undeniable. And her response wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a mirror, held up to a room that had too long benefited from looking away. And just when it seemed Jasmine Crockett had said everything that needed to be said, she reached for a weapon far more powerful than rhetoric. Memory made flesh. She stood slowly but with conviction and said evenly, "Madam Chair, I'd like to call one final witness." The room stirred, not with noise but anticipation. From the side door, flanked by two congressional aides, Mrs. Elsie Freeman entered, a 98-year-old woman whose presence silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane carved from dark wood, her steps careful but unshaken. Her face, lined with time, held no fear, only clarity. Draped across her shoulders was a navy wool shawl, and in her arms she carried a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't a prop. It was evidence, a family record written by hands that had never expected justice but preserved the truth anyway. As Mrs. Freeman was seated and the microphone adjusted, the room instinctively leaned in. She opened the book to a page marked by a threadbare ribbon, her fingers trembling but precise. Then she read, softly at first, but with each word gaining power. Cotton Family Ledger, Georgia Estate, June 12, 1812, she recited. One Negro boy, approximately 14, renamed item number 7. The line landed like a slap, short, brutal, undeniable. The room froze. The senators who moments ago sparred with facts and posturing now sat immobilized by a single sentence that carried the weight of something America still hadn't fully faced. She paused, eyes lifting from the page to find Tom Cotton directly. There was no hate in her gaze, just a fierce, quiet knowing. That boy, she said, was my great-grandfather Samuel. Born free, taken, sold, stripped of his name, and given a number by your family. Cotton's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Not here, not now. Freeman's voice trembled slightly, not with fear but with the sheer force of restraint. You speak of legacy, Senator. Mine begins on a ledger. Yours begins in the signature that wrote him down. She leaned closer to the mic, her tone now steady, deliberate. You called slavery a necessary evil, but to us it wasn't a chapter. It was a sentence, generations long. Another pause. Your ancestors thought we were necessary, but never once did they think we were people. The line hit hard. It didn't rise. It settled like weight across the room. Cotton stared ahead, unreadable. But around him, senators sat with eyes lowered, some clasping their hands, others blinking rapidly as if trying to process not just the moment, but the implications of having to carry it home. In that minute, the narrative shifted, not with anger, not with fire, but with something far more difficult to resist. A living reminder that history isn't over just because the textbook stopped writing it. And Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word as Mrs. Freeman closed her book. She didn't need to. The testimony had already said everything America needed to hear, but had refused to listen to for centuries. The room had already shifted, its moral gravity altered by the quiet dignity of Mrs. Freeman's testimony. But what came next revealed not just discomfort in Senator Tom Cotton's eyes, but something far more telling. Fear, not of Jasmine Crockett, not of political defeat, but of being seen without the armor of controlled narrative. He shifted in his seat, knuckles whitening around the base of his microphone. Then, without warning, his voice sliced through the tension, sharp and rising. Enough! The word wasn't directed at Jasmine. It was directed at the space she had created, the truth she had made impossible to unhear. This entire hearing has been a performance, a partisan stunt orchestrated by the far left. His voice quivered, not with emotion, but the strain of holding on to authority that was slipping from his hands. He kept going, faster now, like a man outrunning his own doubt. I won't sit here and be lectured by people who think America's sins are greater than its strengths, who twist our founding principles into weapons. He waved a dismissive hand toward the folder on the desk, toward the witness chair Mrs. Freeman had just vacated. This is not history. This is theater, selective outrage packaged for media headlines. But something about his words didn't land the way they once did. There was no surge of validation from his colleagues, no approving nods, only silence, and the distant clicking of staffers refreshing their screens. Because while Cotton raged, the real headline was already breaking. One aide, barely able to hide his panic, slipped a phone toward a senior staffer on the Republican side. Another passed a printed page to the committee chair. Jasmine saw it happen. She didn't ask what it was. She already knew. It was the moment she had been warned might come. The moment where truth stopped knocking and kicked the damn door in. The email had leaked. A confidential internal memo from Cotton's own legislative director, dated 6 months earlier, now public. The subject line read like something pulled from a strategy playbook, not a Senate office. Narrative management, education messaging framework. In it, the language was as plain as it was damning. We must present the removal of the 1619 project as a moral obligation, position the initiative as a threat to Western stability, frame history education through a lens of cohesion, not division. Those weren't academic objections. They were talking points crafted to shape belief, to preserve dominance under the banner of unity. And for once, Tom Cotton had nothing left to say. He blinked. Once, twice. The printout was placed in front of him by one of his own. His lips parted, searching for the first word of a rebuttal, but all that came out was a shallow breath. The unraveling had begun, and it wasn't loud. It was quiet, humiliating in its precision. The very foundation of his argument, his defense of objective history, his warning about ideological distortion, had been undercut by his own words, written behind closed doors, never meant to be read by the public he claimed to serve. The chairwoman's voice broke through, calm but piercing. Senator Cotton, the committee has received this document from multiple outlets. Would you like to clarify the phrase, and I quote, controlling narrative flow to reinforce national identity? The sentence echoed across the marble chamber like a dropped gavel. Cotton looked up, but the bravado was gone. The script he had so carefully followed had turned on him. And now, in the very room he thought he could dominate with policy and polished indignation, he found himself exposed, cornered not by political opponents, but by his own strategy laid bare. Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer a pause. It was a boundary. She sat still, composed, her hands resting over the folder like someone who had carried its weight long before the hearing had begun. She watched not with triumph, but with the unshakable awareness of someone who had seen this kind of unraveling before. When the machinery of power is forced to look in a mirror, and all its contradictions are suddenly visible. Cotton reached for his water. His hand trembled. Around him, senators glanced at one another, some with discomfort, others with calculation. But no one came to his defense. No one interrupted. The performance he had accused others of staging had collapsed into something far less theatrical and far more revealing. The truth of how far some would go to protect a version of history that doesn't belong to them, but works for them. And Jasmine? She remained quiet. Because in that moment, silence spoke louder than outrage. It said, this was never about winning the argument. This was about exposing the architecture of denial. And piece by piece, it was crumbling right in front of him. The room had settled into the kind of silence that doesn't invite recovery. It demands reflection. Tom Cotton sat frozen. The documents had been read. The mask had slipped. And for a moment it seemed the hearing might end, not with a vote, but with something quieter and far more permanent. Reckoning. Eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on the woman who hadn't just survived his attacks, but dismantled the scaffolding he'd built around them. And then Jasmine Crockett stood. No fanfare, no announcement, no shifting of papers, no glance at notes. She didn't reach for the binder she had carried with her since the start. She didn't lean on charts or statistics or digital evidence. She stood exactly as she was, unarmed but unafraid. Her blazer still pinned with the image of Harriet Tubman, her stance unshaken. And when she opened her mouth, her voice carried with it not the formality of debate, but the fire of testimony. Not a politician making a point, but a woman making history answer for itself. I came here today, she said, her tone clear and steady, not to perform, not to posture, but to confront a truth this body has evaded for far too long. Her eyes never left Cotton. When a man calls evil necessary, she continued, her voice unflinching, then it becomes necessary to call that man into the light. No one moved, not a cough, not a paper shuffle, not even the usual scribble of a stenographer. Cotton blinked, visibly tense, as if bracing for a second blow, but it never came in the way he expected. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She let each sentence breathe like a drumbeat, and that somehow made it hit harder. Senator Cotton, you stood on this floor and called slavery a necessary evil, as if our ancestors were sacrifices, not stolen lives. As if their backs were bricks in some glorious structure instead of open wounds that never fully closed. Her voice didn't waver, but there was pain in it, not for herself, but for what she carried. And everyone in that chamber could feel it, not sympathy, something heavier. Something that could not be argued with because it was lived. You said you're here to protect America, she said, the words measured and deliberate. But what version of America are you defending exactly? The one in which a boy named Samuel Freeman could be sold as item number 7 feet? The one where we remove stories that don't flatter the victors? The one where history is shaped to comfort the comfortable? She took a step forward, not toward Cotton, but toward the center of the room, into the light pouring down from above. You see, the difference between you and me, she said, is not patriotism. We both love this country, but I don't love it for the myths it tells. I love it for the fight it still requires. And then she turned fully to him, her voice still soft, but cutting with absolute precision. You're not just wrong about history, Senator. You're afraid of it. That sentence didn't echo. It pierced. The room exhaled like it had been holding its breath. Cotton didn't look away, but his expression shifted. Not anger, not defiance. Something closer to unease. He knew that line would follow him. It was already being clipped, captioned, posted, looped. Still, he responded, out of instinct, out of desperation, maybe both. I protect America, he said, his voice clipped, the edge blunted by fatigue. It was supposed to sound resolute, but it didn't land like a statement of strength. It landed like a defense, and Jasmine knew it. I do too, she answered without pause. Her voice was calm, earnest, true. But I don't get to pick the easy parts to protect. I protect the ugly parts, the buried parts, the parts you would rather burn than teach. Now her words turned from the man to the institution around him. She wasn't just addressing Cotton anymore. She was addressing every lawmaker, every official, every person who had ever sat in that chamber and called themselves a steward of the American story. You want to teach pride without pain, triumph without trauma. You want a version of America that looks clean on a bumper sticker, but bleeds the moment you touch it. That's not patriotism. That's denial in a flag pin. Her voice was rising now, not in volume, but in temperature. Not loud, but hot, like steel fresh from the forge. And the people I represent, she said, eyes scanning the room, we live in what your history lessons leave out. We walk through institutions still shaped by that erasure. We read textbooks where our stories are footnotes, if they exist at all. And when we speak up, we're told we're ungrateful. When we testify, we're told we're theatrical. She paused, just for a breath. Then quieter. Senator Cotton, the most dangerous thing you said today wasn't that slavery was necessary. It's that you still think it was strategic, that in some twisted calculus, what was done to us helped make this nation great. She took another step forward, her body now cast in the central light above the witness table. No spotlight, just sunlight from the chamber's skylight window. Pure, silent, impartial. You think I speak from anger? I speak from inheritance? I speak because silence has already done enough damage. I speak because my ancestors wrote letters that were never answered, screamed into fields no one walked back into, and died without a grave that bore their names. She looked back at Cotton one last time. You inherited comfort. I inherited consequences. But you do not get to weaponize my inheritance against me. And then she stepped back, slowly, deliberately, not with the finality of someone done speaking, but with the restraint of someone who knew there was nothing left to say that wouldn't dilute what had already been spoken. The room was silent, truly silent, not out of courtesy, but out of awe. Even the cameras, those ever-hungry eyes of media, seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether what had just happened could even be reduced to sound bites. Cotton didn't speak again, not because he wasn't allowed, but because any word he might have offered would have echoed hollow in the wake of something real. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone, without a teleprompter, without a consultant, without a carefully crafted slogan, had done what centuries of hearings, books, and briefings had failed to do in that very room. She had told the truth, not to win a debate, but to make sure that for once, the record would reflect the blood in the soil. But truth, as Jasmine Crockett knew too well, doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a battlefield. And the moment her words left that hearing room, they didn't travel gently. They ignited. They fractured. They polarized. Because in today's America, even truth has to choose a side. By the time Jasmine stepped out into the hallway, flanked by aides who wore the stunned look of people trying to process history in real time, The world had already begun carving her into myth or tearing her down. Her phone buzzed in short, relentless bursts. Screens across Capitol Hill lit up with breaking headlines. And less than 10 minutes after the hearing adjourned, the media machine roared to life. Fox News opened the floodgates first. The Chiron was blunt. Crockett's theatrics, radical left hijacks historical debate. Tucker Carlson's replacement host called her the latest in a long line of grievance politicians, claiming she was weaponizing identity to dismantle unity. Sound bites of her most searing lines, "You're afraid of history," and "I don't get to choose the easy parts to protect," were looped out of context, framed as evidence of woke extremism, as if acknowledging the pain of the past was now an act of treason. They didn't show Mrs. Elsie Freeman. They didn't quote the ledger. They didn't mention the leaked email. Instead, they zoomed in on Jasmine's face mid-sentence, jaw set, eyes locked, a moment of controlled fury, and painted it as unhinged rage, as if her composure was threatening, as if her truth-telling was violence. The panelists nodded in unison. The ticker rolled, and the verdict was clear. Cotton was cast as the victim, Jasmine the aggressor. But across the media divide, another narrative had taken root, and it was growing fast. On MSNBC, the coverage struck a different chord. Rachel Maddow opened the segment with her usual deliberate intensity. Today, a congressional hearing on education policy became something more than political posturing. It became personal. It became historic. A video clip played of Jasmine standing, no papers in hand, her voice clear as glass. "You're not just wrong about history, you're afraid of it." Then came the headline, stark in its simplicity, "The Woman Who Shook History." It wasn't just a segment, it was a moment. Social media seized it like oxygen meeting fire. Hashtags exploded, "Truth doesn't flinch." Item number 7, "Necessary for who?" Jasmine Crockett was here. On TikTok, young black women stitched videos of their grandmothers watching the hearing replay with trembling hands. On Instagram, classrooms in Detroit, Atlanta, Oakland, and Baton Rouge posted chalkboards scrawled with Jasmine's final line, "I protect the parts that make us honest." Still, the storm was far from one-sided. The Daily Wire ran an op-ed titled, "Crockett's Cultural Coup: Why the Left's War on History is the Real Threat." They accused her of performing pain, of turning national memory into tribal currency. Ben Shapiro called her speech dangerous moral absolutism. Candace Owens tweeted that Jasmine was auditioning for a Netflix miniseries, not serving the American people. And in one particularly viral segment, a Fox contributor mocked her for quoting no founding documents. No Constitution, no Federalist Papers, just emotion and identity. Of course, they omitted that she brought letters from enslaved people, which predated the Constitution's ratification by over a decade. Meanwhile, The Atlantic published a counterpiece titled, "Not Performance: Proof, Jasmine Crockett in the Politics of Unburied Memory." The essay argued that the hearing had become the most important civics lesson aired on live television since Watergate. It traced the genealogy of Jasmine's argument back through Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the decades of whitewashed curricula that followed. To say she performed is to admit you've never seen a black woman allowed to speak uninterrupted, the article read. To call her theatrical is to admit you've forgotten what moral clarity sounds like. But not all the reactions were ideological. Some were deeply personal and quietly seismic. Nicole Hannah Jones, creator of the very 1619 Project Under Attack, tweeted only one thing: "I've waited my whole life to hear that in a government building." Oprah Winfrey called Jasmine that evening. The message was short, emotional, private, but her team leaked one line: "You didn't just testify, you brought the ghosts with you and made them speak." Meanwhile, Cotton doubled down. That night, in an appearance on a conservative podcast, he dismissed the leaked email as selectively edited and labeled the backlash a coordinated smear effort by leftist media elites. But there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something different behind his tone. Exhaustion, or maybe recognition. Not that he had lost, but that he had finally been seen. Still, his base stood by him. Fundraising emails went out with subject lines like, "Fight back against the 1619 takeover." "Stop Crockett's radical history." Within 24 hours, Cotton's PAC reported a $1.2 million surge in donations. Meanwhile, Jasmine's office crashed from email volume. Thousands of letters, stories, invitations, threats, endorsements, hate mail, scholarship requests, offers to help digitize the letters she had read aloud. She was being pulled in every direction, but she didn't respond right away. Not to interviews, not to offers, not even to MSNBC's request for a primetime sit-down. Because in her world, this wasn't over. She knew what the cameras wouldn't show. The staffers who cried in the elevator. The security guard who whispered, "My grandmother would have wanted me to thank you." The Republican senator who didn't say a word but left behind a note on hotel stationery in her committee folder. "My grandfather's ledger says item number non-gom, no signature, just acknowledgement." And that for Jasmine was enough, for now. Because the truth wasn't just a statement she made in that room. It was a living thing now, a fault line running through the country, exposing not just the fracture between left and right, but between those who wanted to remember and those who wanted to forget. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing a reckoning, one that didn't end with a headline, one that didn't fit into a chyron, one that, if done right, would force this country not to choose sides, but to face itself. But truth, once unleashed, rarely returns to its cage. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just pulled back a curtain, she'd torn down a wall. In the days following the hearing, as media networks battled for narrative control and the public split between reverence and rage, a deeper rumble was already starting beneath the Capitol dome. Not a scandal, not a soundbite, but something far rarer, a shift in political will. Quiet at first, reluctant, but real. On the fourth morning, beneath low winter light and tight security, Congress reconvened, and on the agenda was something that hadn't been seriously touched in over a generation: the national framework for teaching racial history in American public schools. The hearing room was different now, more crowded, more cameras, more tension, but it wasn't just journalists packing the benches. It was teachers, civil rights attorneys, museum curators, students flown in from districts fighting to keep race from being erased from their textbooks. They came not as activists, but as witnesses. People tired of being treated like history was something to be negotiated, rather than revealed. At the center of it all sat a new subcommittee, hastily formed but sharply defined: the Congressional Task Force on Historical Equity in Education. And Jasmine Crockett had been asked, not without controversy, to co-chair it. She hadn't planned to. She hadn't asked to. But after her confrontation with Cotton lit up the nation's political nerve, the calls came, not from pundits, but from principals, from librarians in Alabama, from parents in Tulsa, from students in South Carolina, emailing scanned pages of textbooks that still called slaves unpaid workers. So she said yes, and now she sat in the same building, facing the same institution that once tried to define patriotism without pain. But this time, the script had changed. The hearing opened not with pleasantries but pressure. Representative Greg Stanton of Arizona leaned forward, his voice dry but direct. "Let's be clear," he said, holding up a worn social studies textbook from 2004. "This is still being taught in over 2,000 school districts. This book doesn't mention redlining, doesn't mention Tulsa, doesn't mention Japanese internment. It calls slavery a form of labor with disadvantages." He placed the book down with deliberate weight. "What exactly are we so afraid of our children learning?" Then came the flood. Testimony from a Mississippi teacher who'd been suspended for assigning Ta-Nehisi coats, a superintendent from Virginia who faced death threats for defending the right to teach about Jim Crow, a high school junior from Florida who read aloud a passage from her current textbook that described the Civil War as a conflict of differing economic philosophies. And then the question turned back to Jasmine. She didn't bring a folder this time. No letters, no documents, just a single photograph. She held it up. It showed a black boy, maybe 8 years old, standing beside a school display titled Founding Fathers. The captions beneath the portraits were covered in sticky notes. One said, "Owned 123 people." Another, "Never freed his slaves." The teacher had been fired the next day. Jasmine placed the photo face up on the table. Her voice when she spoke was soft, but made of steel. We punish truth-tellers in our classrooms. We erase suffering to protect comfort, and we do it in the name of unity. She looked around the room, not for approval, but for accountability. But history doesn't need to be safe. It needs to be honest. Her words didn't rise. They didn't need to. Everyone in the room remembered what she had done 2 weeks earlier. And now, instead of applause, she was answered by something far rarer in Washington: momentum. Within hours, the debate spread to the Senate floor. Bills were dusted off. Amendments proposed. One group called for a Truth in Curriculum Act, mandating the inclusion of primary source narratives from enslaved people, indigenous leaders, and civil rights movements. Another offered a counter, the Historical Integrity Act, arguing for the preservation of founding values against divisive ideologies. The battle lines were drawn. Again, and once again, Jasmine stood in the crosshairs. This time, it wasn't just cotton. Senator Josh Hawley took to the floor, claiming Crockett's task force was smuggling critical race theory into the bloodstream of American children. Senator Marsha Blackburn accused her of politicizing grief to indoctrinate classrooms. Jasmine didn't respond with fire. She responded with fact. She returned to the committee with a 42-page proposal backed by over 300 historians from institutions across the country: Harvard, Howard, Georgetown, Spelman, and even West Point. It wasn't radical. It wasn't even new. It called for one thing: that America teach its full story, not just the triumphs, but the costs. Not just who wrote the laws, but who lived beneath them. That hearing was different. There were no viral moments, no shouting, just quiet resistance and careful courage. But then came a twist. In the third week of testimony, an unexpected voice appeared on the witness list: Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican. His testimony was short, direct, devastating. When I was a kid, I was taught that America was always the hero, always right, and I wanted to believe that. But history is not a campaign ad. It's a record. We owe it to our children not to lie to them just because we're afraid of the truth. The room didn't cheer. It stood, and Jasmine Crockett, sitting across from him, didn't smile, but her eyes softened, just slightly, because she knew what it took for someone to cross that line, not just politically, but personally. By month's end, the committee had drafted what would become the most controversial education bill since No Child Left Behind. It was called the American Memory Act. Its core tenets were simple: mandatory inclusion of first-person narratives from enslaved Americans in U.S. history curriculum, federal funding for schools to access digitized records from underrepresented communities, protection for teachers who teach verified, historically accurate material, regardless of political backlash. Cotton called it a Trojan horse for shame. MSNBC called it the first serious attempt at historical reckoning in public education. And Jasmine? She just called it a start, because she knew this wasn't a victory. Not yet. This was the middle of the movie. The part where the storm is clearing just enough to reveal how much damage it's done. The part where people begin to ask not just what went wrong, but what had been wrong all along. And for the first time in decades, the halls of Congress echoed not with ideology, but with questions that could no longer be ignored. What does it mean to teach the truth in a country still fighting over who owns it? What happens when the children begin to ask what the adults tried to forget? And what kind of nation are we building if our memory is edited to fit comfort? But even as the committee debated the language of memory and the Senate chamber twisted itself into new ideological knots, something else was taking shape outside the walls of Congress, something Jasmine never anticipated. Because while policies were slow and opposition was loud, the people were still listening, not just voters or teachers or historians, but storytellers, archivists, publishers, those who understood that sometimes the only way to move a nation forward is to write it down, word by word, line by line, exactly as it happened. It started with a single email, then a phone call, then a private meeting in a small office 2 blocks from the Capitol, where Jasmine Crockett sat across from one of the most respected nonfiction editors in New York. "We don't want a memoir," the woman said plainly. "We want the transcript." Jasmine blinked. You mean the hearing? Every word, the editor said. Unabridged, uncut, annotated, yes. Introduced, absolutely. But not rewritten, not polished. We want the fire as it happened. The hearing wasn't just politics, it was a reckoning. And America needs a permanent record. Jasmine said nothing for a moment. Her instinct was caution. After all, the hearing had made her a target. The mail still came, some of it filled with thanks, others with venom. She'd been called brave. She'd been called dangerous. And she'd been called every name that clings to a black woman who refuses to make herself smaller for power's comfort. Putting it all in print meant one thing: no more room to be misquoted, but it also meant no more room to be erased. She signed the deal the next day. The book would be called Necessary for Who, a title pulled directly from the signs held in nationwide protests after Cotton's 2020 quote resurfaced. A phrase that had once been shouted in outrage would now sit in gold foil font across bookstore windows. A question that had haunted every generation of the oppressed would now become the frame for a national dialogue. The process began immediately. The raw transcripts were brutal, unfiltered, and Jasmine insisted they remain so. Every interruption, every gavel bang, every moment of silence between Elsie Freeman's voice and Tom Cotton's unraveling, all of it would be there. But alongside it, there would be footnotes, essays, scans of the original letters from enslaved Americans, testimonies from students who read about the hearing and wrote essays that their teachers had been told not to assign. It would be more than a book. It would be a counter-history, a weapon made of paper. The backlash came fast. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial titled, "Crockett's Courtroom for the Woke, Publishing Rage as Legacy." Senator Cotton himself tweeted, "Turning propaganda into publishing doesn't make it truth. It makes it a product." But what he didn't understand was that truth had always been a product, one shaped, sold, and censored for centuries. And for once, someone like Jasmine was producing it on her terms. The publishing house received threats. Local bookstores reported calls warning them not to carry it. School boards, before the book was even released, circulated preemptive bans. That only made it sell faster. Before it even hit shelves, Necessary for Who became the most pre-ordered nonfiction political book of the year. Not because it was marketed like a celebrity memoir, but because it wasn't a memoir. It was a confrontation, bound in hardcover, page-numbered, indexed, and impossible to ignore. The first chapter, item number, Yeti the second, the silence between sentences. The final, Necessary for Who, a letter to the unnamed. In between were court transcripts, personal essays, and one particularly gutting piece written by Jasmine titled "Inheritance Doesn't Always Look Like Property." It spoke of her grandfather, never wealthy, never recorded in newspapers, but a man who once sat her down after school and said, "Just because they won't teach it doesn't mean it didn't happen." The book launch wasn't a party. It was a reading, held in the same chamber where the hearing took place. Jasmine stood alone at the center. No backdrop, no podium, just a single light above and a wooden chair beside her. That chair was empty, symbolically, deliberately. "I was going to ask someone to sit there," she told the crowd. "Maybe a student, maybe a teacher, maybe Mrs. Freeman." She paused. "But then I realized that chair doesn't belong to a person. It belongs to all the people we were never allowed to quote." And then she opened to page 237 and read aloud a line from Cotton's final rebuttal, "I protect America." Then turned the page and read her reply, "I do too. But I don't choose the easy parts to protect." The silence afterward felt different this time. Not stunned, not cautious, but charged. Like the room understood, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't about a bill, or a headline, or a party line. This was about memory. By the end of the week, Necessary for Who had been excerpted in the New Yorker, cited in a federal education policy debate, and read aloud in classrooms from Oakland to Boston. High school teachers wrote lesson plans overnight. Churches invited readings. Veterans groups ordered bulk copies to learn what we fought to protect. And in a moment few had seen coming, the Library of Congress reached out. They wanted a signed first edition for permanent inclusion in the Civil Rights Archive. It was the first time a sitting member of Congress had written a full public hearing into the historical record, unedited and without institutional filter. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't throw a launch tour. She didn't pose for glamour photos. Instead, she returned to the committee chamber, late at night, alone, and sat in the witness chair. She opened the book, flipped to the section with Mrs. Freeman's testimony, and read it again, slowly under the light, with no one watching. Then she whispered into the silence, "We wrote it down." And this time she knew. It would stay written. 6 months had passed, not enough time to heal a nation, but just enough to test whether the fire Jasmine Crockett lit would survive the cold machinery of politics. It did, and in the most unlikely of places, a public school district in northern Texas, just 200 miles from where her own journey into law and activism had begun. The school board meeting that night wasn't supposed to make headlines. It was item 7 on a long agenda, tucked between budget proposals and cafeteria contracts. But by the time the gavel struck, the gymnasium had become standing room only. Teachers, students, custodians, veterans, and pastors sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs. Some held laminated printouts of Jasmine's quotes. Others clutched history books with sticky notes peeking out, pages they now questioned, truths they had begun to uncover. When the board president read the final vote aloud, 7-0, the crowd didn't erupt. It rose slowly, in silence, as if standing was the only response worthy of the moment. The district's central library, once named for a Civil War general, was officially renamed the Jasmine Crockett Justice Library. Outside, the new sign was unveiled beneath the glow of stadium lights. The metal letters shone like a verdict, bold, unflinching, permanent. Students gathered beneath it for selfies. Parents wiped away tears. And one retired teacher whispered, "We finally told the truth on a building." But not everyone was celebrating. At a press conference in Little Rock, Tom Cotton stood behind a podium bearing a crisp new logo. A white eagle against a black background, its wings drawn back, not soaring but clenched. Below it, his campaign slogan, "Restore Truth." He spoke with the rhythm of a man rehearsed but rattled. "What we're seeing across this country," he began, "is a dangerous attempt to rewrite our founding values, to divide our classrooms, our communities, and our children. We don't need revision. We need restoration. We need to get back to truth, real truth." He didn't mention Jasmine by name. He didn't have to. The dog whistle had become a bullhorn. Networks loyal to his message picked it up immediately. Chirons flashed, Cotton launches war on woke history. Senator, truth is not a feeling. The phrase "restore truth" trended within hours, but so did its rebuttal. Whose truth? Saukajur, Jasmine Library, and topic necessary for who? The divide was no longer theoretical. It was geographical, generational, spiritual. And at its center stood a 619-page congressional transcript, a courtroom confrontation gone viral, and a woman who had never expected to become a symbol, but refused to become a footnote. And then quietly, something extraordinary happened. The Library of Congress updated its homepage. There, beside collections on Lincoln and Douglas, beneath a rotating banner on Reconstruction documents, sat a new feature. A scanned, yellowing letter written in cursive by a 98-year-old woman named Elsie Freeman. The headline was simple: "Featured document, a letter from Mrs. Freeman." The letter, addressed to the children I'll never meet, read, "They will tell you history must be saved. But history is not drowning. It is buried. It does not need salvation. It needs uncovering. It needs breath. It needs to be held up to the light and spoken in full, even when it makes people shift in their seats, especially then." And at the bottom, in a trembling yet steady hand, "History does not need to be saved. It needs to be told completely." Within 24 hours, the library's website crashed under the weight of traffic. Schools printed the letter and framed it. Teachers read it aloud over morning announcements. Some churches replaced their Sunday sermon readings with it. And perhaps most stunningly, a Republican congressman from Ohio quoted it on the House floor saying, "Even when I disagree with the messengers, I can't ignore the message." Jasmine saw the letter late one evening, Long after her final meeting, she was alone in her office, a single desk lamp casting shadows across stacks of books, letters, and media requests she hadn't yet answered. She clicked the link. At first she smiled, then her eyes filled with something harder to name. Not pride, not grief, but confirmation that this fight, born of centuries, carried by grandmothers who weren't allowed to read or write, now lived in pixels and ink, in legislation and street signs, in classrooms and libraries and homepages that used to overlook women like Elsie Freeman. She closed her laptop and whispered, "They're still listening." But elsewhere, the storm was rebuilding. Cotton's campaign was gaining steam. Billionaires lined up behind him. Educational PACs flooded battleground states with ads warning of indoctrination and division. His slogan, "Restore Truth," became a rallying cry at school board meetings where teachers were shouted down and Holocaust comparisons were thrown like darts. But a quieter movement grew alongside it. In Tulsa, a sixth-grade history teacher assigned Necessary for Who as optional reading and ended up with 33 essays turned in voluntarily. In New Jersey, a group of librarians created a nationwide digital archive of suppressed curriculum materials, titled the Freeman Files. And in that Texas district, the one that had renamed its library, students began a new annual tradition, a reading of Elsie Freeman's letter every February, broadcast across the entire district. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the beginning of something Jasmine Crockett had come to understand as more powerful than applause. Persistence. Because in a country always tempted to forget, she had helped it remember. And now the reckoning had a name. A book, a building, and a letter too honest to be ignored. And as the camera lights faded, as the hashtags slowed and the news cycles moved on, what remained was not the noise, but the lesson. It didn't arrive in the thunder of applause or the final swing of a gavel. It came later, quietly, in the spaces between headlines. In classrooms where students whispered, "I didn't know that." In dinner tables where grandfathers paused, remembering things they'd once been told to forget. In the quiet realization that truth, once spoken, doesn't need permission to keep echoing. The lesson was this: that justice is not always loud, but it is always earned. That it takes more courage to tell the truth about who we've been than to pretend we've always been who we claim to be. And that history is not a finished book. It is an unfinished trial, one where the witnesses are still stepping forward and the verdict is not yet written. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand to be admired. She stood because silence had failed too many before her. She stood because someone had to say it, out loud on record, without flinching. The injustice she faced was never just political, it was ancestral. It was woven into the very institutions she was elected to challenge. And yet she never asked for sympathy, only accountability, because she understood what many still refuse to admit, that patriotism without honesty is performance, that legacy without truth is theft, that progress without memory is a lie with better lighting. The human lesson wasn't just that one voice can disrupt power, it was that power fears memory more than rebellion, because memory makes the invisible visible. It gives names to item number Yeti. It writes letters from women like Elsie and refuses to let them fade. It places those stories where even history books once said, "Not important," and it dares to say, "We're still here." In the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She altered the terrain. She proved that the most radical act in America today is to remember fully, not selectively, not conveniently, but completely. Because when a country remembers everything, it cannot deny anyone. And when it denies no one, it finally begins to become the promise written in its founding words, not just for some, but for all. That is the lesson. And that is why it matters. Because in a nation still haunted by the stories it buries, one woman opened the file, held it up to the light and said, "You don't get to skip this chapter. You live in it." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.